I am now going to talk about the ways in which data, the availability of data, move into the space that's produced by these new governing relations. And that it isn't a simple movement, as I've suggested in the earlier statements, in which this data simply moves into the space and it's freely available. That movement is managed and controlled, interpreted, released or confined, depending on how one looks at the actors involved. Okay. But first I want to go back to the history and to this notion that nothing's new entirely, but some things change. I think the most difficult question for us as researchers at the moment in this field is to try to identify where the change actually is, because there's so much talk around change, globalization, Europeanization, everything shifting. And it really helps, I think, to try to grasp and pinpoint particular changes. And as I said, I want to avoid talking about myself a lot, but it did occur to me that I could understand some of the ways in which to identify change by thinking about my own past, because I'm a pre-digital person, and it's quite hard for you who are not pre-digital to imagine what that was like. I've tried to explain to my daughter, who is now 30, I think, 31. Martin's the keeper of the archive. I'm very vague about these things. He's Martin's daughter as well, I should say, just to clarify. I had a whole lot of transcripts of interviews I'd done in the 1970s and 80s. These were on paper. Actually, they were on flimsy paper, which is like toilet tissue, which we used to use in typewriters in the olden days. And I said to her, this is awful. I'm having to spend hours moving this stuff onto digital form. She couldn't understand it. She said, well, why isn't it on your computer? It's because it's on paper. Why is it on paper? It's because we used to type. She said, you mean not electric? It was actually a piece of paper and a typewriter with big, heavy keys, and you sat and you typed your data up. And then you unrolled it, you took it, and if you were very advanced, you had this horrible thing called a Banda machine that you put in and you cranked a big handle and it came out covered in ink, and you were covered in ink, and that was how you made copies. There were no photocopiers. So in my early work, I worked for the National Union of Teachers, which is the biggest English teachers union, and was in the 1970s very powerful. My job was to provide administrative support for the people in the union who wrote policy. And at that time it was important because the union was powerful and it was acknowledged by government as a partner. It discussed policy with the government ministry and with the local authorities, who also at that time existed and were powerful. They all looked like government organizations. They were bureaucracies. They were hierarchical. I was literally housed in the bottom of the building and the senior people were in the top. They had the same grades as the civil service in terms of work. But what I did every day, among many other things, was to receive the post, right? Receive the post. You don't receive post anymore, it's all on your email. I got a physical, huge straw basket full of letters in envelopes sent by the many thousands of National Union of Teacher members who had an inquiry. What's the union's position on this if this happens to me in my school? How do I advise as a local representative? How do I take action where a head teacher is behaving inappropriately in a school? I had to open all these letters, catalogue them in a great big ledger like a Bible, make some classification of what kind of inquiry they were, assign them to an expert, and then I had, on pain of death, to ensure that they were answered within a certain amount of time and to enter the answer in this logbook. This book then became the knowledge repository. So one built through case activity a set of policies. So when we came to devise a policy on pay or on how school representatives should be treated in the school organization, it was my job to take all this material, collate it, distill it, make it into a set of recommendations, and then take it to the elected official and say, well, what about this? And then they would adjust it so that it would fit with the politics, because, you know, unions like governments have a lot of politics within them. And that was how policy was made. So all I'm trying to do is underline that we had a very different set of knowledge practices, and the material conditions under which knowledge was made were very different. And the things that are important about that are to do with how knowledge becomes embodied through precedent in individuals who are working with it. You know? What they do, the knowledge that actually gets worked with, is carried around by the person. You know? It's not a question of looking up Google or finding your folder. You have to find the person who dealt with this kind of stuff, and you have to interface with them. You have to talk to them to find out, extract from them what that knowledge form was. This is very slow, very cumbersome, very dependent on the capacity of the individual, and very, very fixed in past practice. This is not knowledge that looks forward. It's always knowledge that thinks about what did we do before. It's knowledge that finds it quite hard to deal with new situations. It's always looking for guidance from the past. In 1975, OECD came to England, there's nothing new under the sun, and said, this is ridiculous. In the modern age, faced with financial crisis, this is how you make policy, because what happened in the NUT was also happening in government, even more so. And so OECD said, come on, yeah, modernize, open up, bring in people from outside, bring in experts from business, start applying principles across the board, not just to education, open up the civil service, bring in people from business, management, apply those principles. Well, of course, being the UK government, nothing happened until Thatcher, and then we have the delivery of those agendas, but from a slightly different perspective. So things have changed, but it's finding where they've changed, and I'm now on the data point. I just really like this slide because it looks like an owl, and you know that, I think it's either Goethe or Kant, somebody must know, the owl of Minerva flies by night? No?
I know that. I don't know the answer.
You don't know the answer?
No,
it's bad. What's happened to classical scholarship? What's happened to my memory? Anyway, I like it just because it looks like an owl, and we had this notion in the Enlightenment period that the owl came out at night and perched on the shoulder of the scholar, working quietly in his little study, and now we have this stuff all the time flowing around us. And the consequences are, according to some of its more extreme adherents, that we don't actually need other forms of knowledge, we just need the data. We don't need social science knowledge in particular. We don't need to know why people do things, just that they do and what they do. And this very extreme form of the data mission is one that has found some popularity in the growth of big data, in the growth of the influence of McKinsey, for example, and Pearson in the education field. One could even see PISA through this lens, that you don't need to know anything about what's going on in the context, you just need to know what people are doing. So this amazing data explosion also creates, as I've said earlier, the need for some form of simplification, because we simply can't cope with raw data in unexpurgated form, flowing freely, being produced by different actors, different commercial actors. There has to be an intervention process through which this material is translated. And as Luis Miguel Carvalho has pointed out very forcefully, the only way of doing that is to introduce the principle of comparison. So we now no longer think about how we know where we are unless we know it in relation to someone else. This happens at the level of the individual learner, right up to the nation state. There is no place without comparison. As well as comparison, in order to translate and make manageable the data flow, we bring in consultants and experts. Because we need this process of translation, we need them to claim expertise, to claim the capacity to be above the national, to be free of the complexities of context, to be able to translate for policymakers. And the way in which these people operate, the way in which they're selected, the way in which they move in organizations across the globe means that they are able to constantly reinforce their claims to objectivity, to being outside the complexity of the home or the national space. I'm coming to a conclusion, but just to recall Martin's anecdote about Eurostat and how he was in this room full of people in Brussels, and the senior analyst said, "I can see Europe from here. I'm making Europe through data. I'm calling it up. It's here, I see it." The second part of the quotation was, "You can't see it because you're up to your eyes in the national. But when I look at," and he gives the example of Scotland, "when I look at Scotland, I see what really works in Scotland," he says. "You can't, because when you're in it, you're always saying, this is my system, I know what works, this is what we're going to defend." But if you're outside in this new space, you can really see what works. So there's that claim to expertise is accompanied by comparative knowledge, claims to objectivity that are brought about through decontextualization. But of course, they're not really floating free. These are people with strong commercial and political interests. So, to come to the end, some answers perhaps. What forms of knowledge and expertise are valorized? Well, it's data-based, decontextualized, generic, comparative, performance-based, enabling application of universal principles, knowledges and skills. So you see this trend towards the adoption of very similar policies in Europe and globally in education, and a real difficulty in contesting that agenda because it's said to be evidence-based. It's what works. We know it works. And you see the displacement, I would argue, of social scientific knowledge, because social scientific knowledge is not necessarily comparative, it's not necessarily translatable. Indeed, if it's any good, it shouldn't be, and it's contested. It's bound to be and should be a place of contestation. Who gets to enter into governance roles? Well, we see the growth of the power of legal practitioners at the point of interpretation between data and system. We saw this, for example, in Sweden with the use of law graduates as inspectors of schools. They didn't know anything about education, but that was almost a virtue. So those who get to enter and those who get to be excluded are these new elites. What are the conditions? The conditions that allow for transacting, for translating, for mediating, brokering into actionable knowledge. Not knowledges and skills that go deep, that are difficult to express, that are problematic, that are disputed, that take time, that have a history, and that understand their history. And that's my final point. It's some kind of defense of the stuff that's excluded from here. And it's a plea to sociologists of education, as you are, to remember that one of the key functions of sociology is to examine where knowledge comes from, including the knowledge it holds itself. It's that essential principle of sociological inquiry, constantly recursive, constantly asking, why this knowledge now? Not just official knowledge, but scientific knowledge. Why does it look like this now? Why are we confronting these problems now? Where has this come from? Whose interests does it serve? That responsibility, I think, is even more needed now than in the past. So that's my end. It isn't actually, I've got lots more, but I haven't got time for it. Thank you.